saying that they are responsible for the re-election of Donald Trump because they protested the actions of Biden is the most lib shit I have ever seen in my life.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
I did want to make sure that we talked about what's going on college campuses across the country, because across the country, students and workers, it's important to recognize that a lot of these people involved in these protests are actually workers at the college campuses. They're not just students, they're workers. On college campuses across the country, students and workers are standing up against their universities' complicities in the atrocities being committed in Gaza by Israel. And there's an attempt to smear these people as anti-Semitic, to smear the thrust of the movement as anti-Semitic, as pro-terrorist, as anti-American. And I find this so frustrating because, just for one, just as a matter of statistics, of course, in any group of people, you're going to find bigotry, right? So there very well may be discrete examples of anti-Semitism in some of the encampments. Although, to be completely honest, I have not seen one. I've seen allegations and I have seen incidents that people are pointing to as anti-Semitic, but the supposedly offending actions have always simply been criticisms of Israel's actions or of Zionism as an ideology, and resistance against agitators who are trying to go around and harass anti-war demonstrators. Those are all the things. I have seen allegations of anti-Semitism, and I have seen incidents that people point to as anti-Semitic, but they have all not been actually anti-Semitic. And the use of anti-Semitism as a cudgel in these instances that I have seen have all been totally cynical and really pretty gross to use the legacy of anti-Semitism as a weapon to push for war, to push for killing, to push for the destruction of entire civilization and a people. Really gross, really gross. Now, has there been radical rhetoric and actions that I've disagreed with that I've seen in these protests and in these encampments? Of course, but there's not been anything that I've seen that's been motivated by bigotry. And in any protest, you are going to get people on a radical edge saying and doing weird shit, right? I mean, that's just what is going to happen in any protest. But the thrust of these encampments and what they're doing, peacefully occupying green spaces on their universities. Again, this is not, these are not violent. These are peaceful demonstrations on university campuses. What they're asking for, the thrust of these demonstrations, is for Israel to end its assault on Palestinians and for our institutions in the United States to cut off support for these actions. That thrust of this movement is obviously correct in exactly the same way that anti-war protesters were correct with respect to Vietnam and Iraq, and in exactly the same way that anti-apartheid demonstrators were correct with respect to the U.S. South and South Africa. Obviously, in any of those movements as well, there were discrete incidents of in any of those movements, there are going to be discrete incidents of actions that would be condemnable or inadvisable. And the media of the day did exactly the same thing that media is doing today to manufacture consent against the cause of the protesters, again, as the media is doing today about these protests. In the 60s, for example, during the sit-ins, which were, by the way, actually occupations of private businesses that literally interfered with commerce, right? If you were in one of these places where protesters were sitting in, you were not able to engage in the commerce and the private business activity that you would normally have been able to engage in. As opposed to today, these occupations of green spaces on public universities, where the First Amendment is in full effect, that do not even interfere with students' ability to get to class, much less interfere with private commerce, right? So that's, pretty radical differences here in that what's happening on college campuses today is actually much less radical than what was happening in the fight against Jim Crow in the U.S. South. During the sit-ins, the majority of the American public was opposed. They thought that the sit-ins and anti-Jim Crow demonstrations were actually, quote, doing more harm than good for the Negro. When MLK was assassinated, he was one of the most unpopular people in America. Extremely unpopular among white Americans. The Vietnam and Iraq protesters were literally tarred with the exact same names as the protesters today: anti-American, pro-terrorist, etc. And yet, now, the folks in all of those movements are studied and remembered as they rightly should have been regarded in their day, heroic and on the right side of history. And that's exactly how the people who are protesting today are going to be remembered 20 and 30 years out. They were doing the right thing, they were on the right side of history, and they were more brave and, in doing things that everybody else, everybody else should have been doing something. They were doing more than most people. That's how folks in the anti-Vietnam, anti-Iraq, anti-South Africa, and anti-Jim Crow protests are remembered today. That's how the pro-Palestinian demonstrators are going to be remembered in 20 or 30 years. But it is still unfortunate that today, in the reality that we live in, they are not regarded that way. They're being tarred as pro-terrorist, anti-American, evil, wicked, etc., etc. And people who are saying this in the media, by and large, are lying. They don't believe it. They don't actually believe that these demonstrations are quote-unquote pro-Hamas. They don't actually believe that these are anti-Semitic. It's all cynical. It's all people lying. They don't believe it. It's also worth mentioning that, while maybe or maybe not there have been discrete incidents of bigotry among pro-Palestinian protesters, there has been a pattern of violence against these peaceful demonstrations, both by police and by pro-Israel counter-demonstrators. In one incident, a 65-year-old former head of Jewish studies, that's right, a former head of Jewish studies was assaulted by the police. In other incidences, pro-Israel demonstrators were yelling the N-word. At Ole Miss, pro-Israel demonstrator, with the approval of an entire crowd of people around him, was dancing like a monkey and making monkey noises at a black woman who was pro-Palestinian. I mean, these are the kind of people that the Democrats are siding with, right? I mean, that's the people that Joe Biden right now is in coalition with as he supports the far right in Israel in carrying out the destruction of Gaza. He is in coalition with racist frat boys in Mississippi who are dancing like a monkey, taunting pro-Palestine demonstrators. He is in coalition with people who are assaulting 65-year-old Jewish women. He is in coalition with people who are yelling the N-word. That's the people that he is in coalition with right now as he's carrying out this, supporting the destruction of Gaza by Israel.
Hey, 5 seconds, just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Unlike some of these other times in American history where unions have had a mixed record at best, the record of the labor movement during the civil rights movement, was probably net positive, but on Vietnam, on Iraq, not net positive, certainly. On the South Africa protest, it was probably a net positive. But so far, the labor movement has been much more universally or much more decidedly on the side of the Palestinian protesters, which is good. And in particular, against their abuse and violence against these protesters. Unions standing against this include the Communication Workers of America, CWA, who put out the following statement. A couple of things from that statement. Over the past few weeks, attacks against students, journalists, and workers who have been engaging in and reporting on peaceful protest against Israel's siege on Gaza have escalated. Corporations are firing workers for speaking up. Police have arrested and brutally attacked student protesters. Journalists covering these events have been attacked and detained, and campus workers are facing retaliation and attacks from institutions whose core values should include academic freedom and peaceful assembly. The Communication Workers of America represents journalists, Google workers, and thousands of campus workers, including students across the country. We are outraged and disturbed by the use of force on our CWA members and other students, campus staff and faculty, community members, and journalists at these peaceful protests. We condemn Google's illegal termination of workers, including some AWU-CWA members who raised concerns about the company's contracts with the Israeli military. We believe that the fundamental right to freedom of speech and assembly is essential to maintain in any democracy, and is one important way union members and other activists have changed the tides of history. Over the past 7 years, 43 states have enacted anti-protest legislation. The extreme repressive response to these protests is part of an alarming push by institutions to limit free speech. We reaffirm our call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and are proud to stand in solidarity with our members and all students standing up for peace and justice. And this last point that they made about the freedom of speech is really interesting, because we have seen by and large, the people who have actually made a big stink about campus free speech specifically come out in favor of the repression of these protests, in favor of violence against people in these peaceful encampments who are not interfering with people's, even with people's ability to go to class, much less interfering in their private commerce. So, it's just worth noting the next time that these people come out in support of freedom of speech, that this, much like their claims that these protests are anti-Semitic, is completely cynical. They do not care about free speech, in particular on college campuses. The National Nurses Union, National Nurses United, came out with a statement as well, saying that our union stands in solidarity with student and faculty protesters at campuses across the United States facing a violent crackdown for speaking out against the mass killings and public health catastrophe in Gaza. Amid the ongoing Israeli military campaign that has killed, injured, and displaced tens of thousands of Gazan civilians, nurses remain steadfast in our belief in the human rights to health, safety, free speech, collective action, and protest. NNU has called for and still calls for a permanent and lasting ceasefire in Gaza and the swift delivery of humanitarian aid in Palestine. Nurses condemn the decisions made by university administrators to respond to protests with police violence, intimidation, and repression. The rapid deployment of state-sanctioned violent force in response to these peaceful protests is an incredibly troubling sign of how these administrators respond to collective action and protest, which are essential for the exercise of free speech rights and labor rights on campuses and all workplaces, especially in a political atmosphere of broader, increasingly anti-democratic authoritarianism. Union nurses know the importance of collective action and protest, which have been fundamental to the trade union movement and to all struggles for justice throughout history. We condemn any efforts to criminalize or restrict these protests. Violent crackdowns to suppress protected free speech are at odds with nurses' value to speak up and speak out when something is wrong and people are hurting or dying because of it. Nurses in the United States continue to mourn the lives lost to this violence during and since October 7th, and we condemn anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of bigotry on college campuses, in our hospitals, and in our communities. As nurses and as a union, NNU calls for an immediate ceasefire, delivery of humanitarian aid, release of all hostages, and an end to this violence. We urge all parties to protect human life and the health and well-being of civilians in both Israel and Palestine. And that one is worth, that's the point about the ceasefire in Gaza. There are attempts to make it seem as if Israel is willing to to enact a ceasefire, but it is Hamas that is stopping this. And this is obviously not the case. Hamas has put on the table for months a hostages for ceasefire deal. Now, is that, should Hamas surrender without conditions? Sure. Should they give the hostages back without conditions? Sure. But politically speaking, it is just not true that if the hostages were returned, the war would be over. In fact, just yesterday, Benjamin Netanyahu expressly rejected that offer. Expressly rejected it. SEIU is another union that put out a statement. SEIU represents nearly 100,000 educators, graduate student employees, professional and support and contract staff who work at colleges and universities across the nation. We are workers who help make colleges and universities run. We are faculty, administrative staff, graduate workers, resident assistants, librarians, cafeteria workers, janitorial staff, maintenance crew, and others who play critical roles in educating and supporting campus communities and providing safe and clean campuses. The suppression of free speech sets a dangerous precedent for all who seek justice, whether it's students calling for institutional accountability or workers organizing for better conditions on the job. As campuses around the United States are erupting in protest over the horrors and injustice Palestinians are facing, SEIU proudly stands in solidarity with the students, faculty, and staff exercising their right to speak up. We condemn the silencing of democratic protests on college campuses, just as we condemn anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and hatred in all its forms. The UAW has been particularly good on this issue. With the UAW local representing UCLA workers getting ready to authorize a strike. This was their region's statement on the issue. Over the last 2 days, the UCLA administration has condoned the brutal attack of students and workers as they peacefully protested for justice in Palestine. Rather than negotiating with the protesters and de-escalating, UCLA administration's actions have caused dozens to seek medical attention and hospitalizations, a militarized police presence on campus, and the arrest of more than 130 students and workers, including UAW 4811 members. As a former teaching assistant, reader, and tutor at UCLA, I am outraged by the administration's actions. This is from UAW Region 6 Director Mike Smith? Mike Miller, sorry. UAW 4811 members have taken swift action to respond, working alongside thousands of other students and workers at UCLA to mobilize for free speech and safety on campus and to demand justice for Palestine. Today, UAW 4811 members are preparing to file unfair labor practice charges over UC's actions and are moving towards a strike authorization vote. This comes less than a week after UAW 872 members at University of Southern California also filed an unfair labor practice over similar failures by the USC administration. As Local 4811 members move towards a strike authorization vote, we know that you have the full support of your Region 6 siblings across the West Coast and your UAW siblings across the continent as you stand up for your rights and give voice to those impacted by the war in Gaza. Our union has taken a clear stance calling for a permanent ceasefire and justice in Palestine, and I am proud to work alongside my fellow International Executive Board members and UAW members across the country to continue escalating the call for a ceasefire and an end to the death, destruction, and human suffering in Palestine. UAW members across the country are prepared to do what it takes to win justice for working people across the world and to secure a permanent ceasefire in Palestine. I am immensely proud of the actions members across Region 6 have taken for months to fight for peace and justice in Gaza and to demand action from their employers and elected officials alike. As Brother Shawn Fain said so well yesterday, if you can't take the outcry, stop supporting this war. And that's the other angle to this, is the political angle. We've seen Democratic operatives flail, saying that demonstrators are going to re-elect Trump, including the number 2 Democrat in Alabama, Tabitha Eisner. She said on Twitter that this is how you get Trump, referring to UA protests. And, that's just particularly gross because Tabitha was only elected because socialists who were at the UA protests organized enough people to get onto the Democratic Executive Committee for the state to elect her to that position. So really gross that she's coming out and smearing these activists, saying that they're going to be electing Trump. because obviously that is not true. It will be Biden who will reelect Trump if this issue is the issue that the election turns on, because Biden's actions have obvious and predictable consequences, which is that young people will oppose the war. This is not something that is strange or unpredictable. It is, in fact, very predictable, and that is what is happening. So, the idea that you would be looking at individual students on college campuses and saying that they are responsible for the reelection of Donald Trump because they protested the actions of Biden, instead of looking at the Biden administration and saying that they are responsible for provoking this outcry by supporting the mass killing of civilians in Palestine with our tax dollars, is the most lib shit I have ever seen in my life. And it is absurd, and it is gross. It is gross. Responsibility obviously lies with Biden, and Shawn Fain had some words of wisdom. This war is wrong, and this response against students and academic workers, many of them UAW members, is wrong. We call on the powers that be to release the students and employees who have been arrested, and if you can't take the outcry, stop supporting this war. That's pretty simple. Pretty simple, not complicated, obvious political point.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.